I appreciate your time, and I wanted to just go through a couple like obligatory slides here. One is that I am funded by a variety of places, the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at Ohio State University, as well as the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins, and a variety of other nonprofit funders that fund our work. I really wanted to start here for today's talk. These are the relationships in my life that give me meaning and connection, and that I derive so much of my understanding of what drives the work that I'm doing in psilocybin therapy and in the studies that we're doing at Hopkins and Ohio State. And I thought for a talk on the importance of relationships in psychedelic therapy that it would be a good place to start. I think that not only human relationships, but relationships with the natural world are also kind of integral components of what has formed my identity and what continues to form my identity as part of this research. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things today. I know most people in this room probably have oriented themselves to what psychedelic effects, specifically psilocybin effects, are, either potentially through your own, of course, legally sanctioned use, or through the variety of research that's been published on this topic over the last several decades. But I'm going to orient folks because one thing that I've found as a researcher and as someone who's just also interested in this space is that there are new measurements, there's new studies that are getting published all the time to help us understand what these experiences are. And even though it's just scratching the surface, I feel like it might be helpful to orient around that. I'm going to talk about our depression trial at Hopkins and the primary outcomes that we had up to a year after that treatment was completed for those participants, and then dive into the topic of the Therapeutic Alliance and the relationship and what impact that had on the outcomes that we saw in that study. So most people have heard of the mystical experience. I don't think I need to describe that necessarily to you, but I will say that one thing I like to point out about the reason why the mystical experience has consistently been shown to be related to outcomes across many, many trials at this point is not because the mystical experience is the end-all be-all of psilocybin. The mystical experience just happens to be one of the first questionnaires that was developed in this scientific space, and so therefore it's been included on all of those trials. We didn't have measures for decades on other types of experiences that one might have in a psilocybin experience, and so one thing that I remember a stats professor telling me when I was in graduate school is that you're only going to find significant findings for the variables that you put into the model. So that's why the mystical experience, in my opinion, consistently shows up as significant. This is one of the only things that's ever been included. However, there are a variety of other measures over the last 5 years that have been developed and have started to peer into the varieties of psilocybin experiences that people are having. Ego dissolution is one of them, understanding kind of people's experience of feeling a sense of union with others, a notion, kind of losing notion of like self within the context of a community and the universe. Also challenging experiences, understanding the different types of difficult emotions that might come up or physical sensations. The visions or the visuals sometimes can also be challenging. And emotional breakthrough, which I really am excited about this topic because I think that understanding these cathartic experiences, understanding how people might have these emotional releases, even in the absence of a spiritual or mystical experience, seems to also now be pointing towards some important significance in understanding what might be therapeutic. We've also more recently developed the Psychological Insight Questionnaire. This is peering into understanding of new realizations or awarenesses that people might get in a psychedelic experience. For some, we've heard people describe this as a download of information, some type of understanding about themselves, relationships, might be about the world around them. For some people in our clinical trials, this insight often has to do with whatever clinical challenges someone might be dealing with. So for PTSD, that might look like someone who has a new understanding of the impact of their trauma or can see their trauma in a different way than maybe they couldn't see before. And one that is, as far as I know, does not have any standardized measurement yet are, of course, all of the different, maybe hundreds or more of different somatic effects that might happen during the psilocybin experience. Sometimes these are very unusual. We've had some people describe, I had one participant in particular who for hours said that he was feeling like his body was being churned on the inside by a metal octopus that was kind of slowly like eating up all of his organs and then like pooping them out of its rectum. We don't have a measure for that, but I would categorize that as a somatic and maybe other effect as well. So we're still limited, right? Even with all of these measures, we still don't have the ability to capture all of the nuance that can come up in these types of experiences. But starting from this place, I wanted to talk about these experiences in the context of our clinical trial. So at Johns Hopkins, 2 years ago, we published our primary outcomes from a waitlist controlled trial of psilocybin therapy. This study was for 24 people with major depressive disorder. And these individuals engaged in this study for up to a year after their psilocybin sessions were over. This annoying kind of complex diagram really just shows that the people on the top row were the folks that got the treatment right away. And the people on the bottom row, they had the same exact treatment, they just waited 8 weeks before starting. For folks in this study, they engaged in 8 hours of preparation. They had 2 psilocybin sessions, one at 20 milligrams and one at 30 milligrams, and that was dosed by body weight in this study. And then they had integration therapy and depression assessments up to 12 months later. A little bit about the demographics of the folks in this study. There were more females in the study than males. We also had, unfortunately, sparse diversity in this study. Most people were white. Most people were also heterosexual. And the therapy in this study was what we consider at Hopkins and to some extent at Ohio State, where I work now, as kind of the standard psilocybin approach. So our preparation phase really was designed to build trust and rapport, to build a connection with the individual, to help facilitate the foundation of a safe setting for the individual. We answered a lot of practical questions about psilocybin and the effects that might come up. Basically everything that you've probably heard about from a lot of the research that was happening at the time. We also importantly talked about the role of touch and consent in the psychedelic experience. And also one thing that I think is rather important is also how to navigate withdrawal of consent in an altered state. And so that's something that I think hasn't gotten as much attention, is how does one navigate that when they might not have the verbal ability to speak or to assess what they want or don't want in the moment. So after all of this, people would go into their dosing session. And for the purpose of this study, we primarily viewed the dosing session as a time to support the individual with whatever experience was coming up for them. Not a time for therapy, but a time to ensure that there was a safe setting, that their needs were met, that if anything came up that was potentially going to put the individual at risk, that we were there to support and facilitate whatever came up in that session. Obviously monitoring vitals, connecting in periodically to just check on how things are going, et cetera. Sometimes towards the end of that day, we might engage in some therapeutic things as it comes up. For some people, they might want to start just spontaneously talking about the types of experiences that they're having, the meaning that they're making from it, et cetera. But we would try to limit that as much as possible until the next day. One common thing that we do in all of our studies is at the end of the day, we ask people to write up a session report or a trip report about what happened in their session and bring that in the next day for integration therapy as a starting point of how we can kind of just start to engage in that integration process. For the integration, we start with the session report. We review that. We explore the meaning that they're making out of it, even just within the couple hours or day after their experience. And we also then start to talk about, as a future-looking process, how to weave into their lives either the meaning or the insight, for some people, the spiritual experience that they've had, or anything else that has come up, and how they want to not only make sense of that cognitively or emotionally, but how they want to behaviorally integrate that in their day-to-day. For people with depression in this study, often that looked like changing environmental things that they felt like were maybe kind of making it difficult for their depression symptoms to get better, or that we're kind of predisposing depression to have kind of like a safe place to be in, that they realize like, oh, maybe this relationship isn't consistent with me being a non-depressed person or actually getting better from this. We try to encourage people not to like immediately file for divorce in those situations, but we did have at least a couple of people who within the year after did end their relationship. For some people, it's about their employment, or it might be about an activity, something important to them that they haven't done in decades that they want to reintegrate into their life. So the primary outcomes from this study showed that on this graph, it's the folks in the top row that were in that wait group. And so that's their depression over time as they waited for treatment. The folks with the orange squares on the bottom row, those are the people that got treatment right away. And the reason we did that comparison is because we wanted to be able to tell that if something happened after psilocybin therapy for the people that got the treatment right away, that it didn't mean that just depression would have changed on its own over time, right? So it's clearly not as sophisticated as a active control or a placebo control, but it was at least a way for us to control for just the natural fluctuation in depression that can happen for some people. If anything, we actually saw depression get a little bit worse in the people that had to wait. I don't know, this is anecdotal, I don't know if it's like reliable information, but I will say as the clinician in this study, or one of the clinicians in this study, that it seemed to be like for some reason all the people who were really struggling with depression got randomized to that wait. And so they had to not only deal with having to come off all their medications for the study, but then they had to wait another 2 months before getting into the trial. So we had a lot of folks who that was not easy for them to get through. We also saw that when we looked at everyone, so after everyone had the treatment, we found that there was a significant and very large reduction in depression. The effect sizes are of course influenced by the fact that this is a small trial. We did not have a placebo control. These effects, the D values, are probably overinflated for those reasons. Not to mention the fact that we had to have a very select screening process. But even if we cut those effect sizes in half, they're still larger, almost 2 times larger than the effect sizes we would see for antidepressants or other therapies. We also looked at depression changes more closely to the session days. So that depression outcomes you just saw were at 1 week and 4 weeks after their second psilocybin session. This slide is depression the day after their first psilocybin session, tracked repeatedly weekly, and then the day after their second psilocybin session as well. So we actually saw that at the lower dose is where we see a pretty substantial and significant drop in depressive symptoms that actually kind of maintained throughout the second session into the 1 month follow-up. In terms of response and remission, clinical response is defined as at least a 50% or greater drop in depression scores. And for this study, almost 3/4 of the people in the study had that clinically significant response. That's not the same thing as remission. Remission is the absence of a clinical diagnosis. What we found is that 50%, a little bit over 50% of people met criteria for a complete remission from their depression after the trial intervention was completed, which was very exciting. But what I like to point out, because of all the hype that gets promoted in the media, is that meant that almost 50% of people were not in remission. So yes, very exciting for the half that were. For the other half, not cakewalk, right? Still dealing with depression. Now, about 1/4 of those people had that clinically significant response, so they were still feeling better, but their depression was still there. And for some people, their depression not only came back, but for a couple people, it got worse. Interestingly, though, regardless of whether they said or reported through assessment that their depression was improved or not, 100% of the people in the study said it was one of the most psychologically insightful experiences of their entire life. Almost all of them also said that it was one of the most personally meaningful experiences, which was really interesting to see in the integration therapy, because for that half of people who did not have the remission, they still believed that there was something really important that came from these experiences that helped their path forward in a new way. So as an example, we had a participant who reported that although their depression was actually worse than it was before the study, that they were able to see their symptoms in a new way. They didn't identify as a depressed person as much as they identified as somebody who has like a lot of other gifts and qualities who just happens to also have depressed symptoms. And for them, that was really helpful because in the moments where their depression was really bad, it still allowed them to understand that there were things that they wanted to do regardless of how they were feeling. So it kind of gave them a little bit of motivation to act in ways that were consistent with these other things that were important to them in their life. This is the findings from our 12-month follow-up, which we published last year. And what we found was essentially that those antidepressive effects lasted up to a year after the trial was completed. Now, I like to point out on this slide that the bars that go above and below are pretty big. So we had some people who literally had zero depression as rated on this clinician assessment, but there were obviously about half of the group that were still above that diagnostic line. I really like this graph, which is, this shows all of the individual trajectories of depression assessments in the study. And so you can see on the top there, that's someone who had pretty severe depression before the study. It dropped a little bit, but that's one of the people that ended up getting worse up to the year after. And then you see all of the different varieties of experiences that people had, right? We do see like overall this drop in depression, but some people it was up and down, and there's a slight trend, if you kind of can see from the middle over, there's a slight trend for some of that depression coming back towards that 12-month mark. So where does the therapeutic alliance or the relationship fit into this? There was a great talk earlier today by some of the researchers at Imperial College, and I hope that folks got a chance to see their presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well. They looked at it in their depression trial, and one of the things that I really appreciated about their talk is they highlighted the importance not only of the relationship, but also of understanding how the relationship in a variety of different ways can impact not only the acute experience that people are having, but also the kind of long-term therapeutic needs that might come up depending on the type of relationship that's emerging therapeutically. Therapeutic alliance is well known to psychological and other psychotherapy research. It's been shown across all different types of conditions and populations, as well as different types of therapies, to be one of the strongest predictors of outcome. And so, not surprisingly, both groups across the Atlantic have started looking into this. In their study, they looked at this, at least so far as I know, this is the publication that came out last year, looking at this in their randomized trial comparing an SSRI to psilocybin. And what they found, if you haven't had a chance to read the full paper, they found a lot of really cool, complex things, which I don't have time to go into. What I would say here is the main finding, which is therapeutic alliance, or that relationship that they were able to build clinically between the therapists and the participants, was related to the types of effects that they had. So the participants who were more bonded reported more intense emotional breakthrough experiences. They had more intense mystical experiences, and that was related to the antidepressant effects of that intervention. So that led us to question in our study, one of the things that we were interested in is, does therapeutic alliance change, right? From before the psilocybin sessions, does it grow as people have these experiences to be stronger, or perhaps for those who maybe aren't improving, does it actually get more difficult in that relationship after psilocybin experiences? We were also curious if that therapeutic alliance was associated with the acute effects that we measured in our trial. For us, that was mystical and insight experiences. So we were curious to know if those were related. And we were also curious to know if the relationship was related to not only depression symptoms right after the treatment, but because we had this year-out data, we were curious how enduring is that relationship in terms of how it predicts effective treatment. I should mention before I share our results that our protocol included therapy at all of those follow-ups. So their therapists who worked with them in the psilocybin session were the therapists that met with them at each of those time points up to a year later. So before I share the results, I just wanted to orient people to what we're talking about, what the participants actually filled out in the study. They filled out a measure called the Working Alliance Inventory, which is a measure that's used in lots of different types of studies. We had them fill out this measure right after the last preparation session, before they went into their first psilocybin session, to measure what had been developed relationship-wise at that point. We also asked at 1 week after the first session, so in between their psilocybin sessions, and then we asked 1 week after their final psilocybin session. And the questions on this measure ask things about whether or not they believe that the therapist likes them, whether they think that what they're doing in this experience is giving them new ways of looking at their problems. It kind of asks about, probes into like the respect that they might have formed between each other. And this is, as I mentioned, completed by the participant. So it's their perspective. And we did not have access as therapists to this information. So they filled this out on their own. And then we weren't able to know at that point as therapists kind of how this was going. So what we see here is that there was a significant increase in this relationship from before the first psilocybin session to after the second psilocybin session. It was a moderate effect. So, in 24 people, if I'm being honest, I was surprised that there was anything significant here. But it is kind of curious that even with such a small sample, we are seeing that relationship does seem to increase over the course of the intervention. We also found that there was a significant moderate correlation between the relationship scores before the psilocybin session and the intensity of their mystical experiences. We also saw a correlation between the intensity of insight experiences as well. Interestingly, when we looked at the Therapeutic Alliance and its association with the depression outcomes, what we found here was a strong and significant correlation between the bond of that relationship and less depression, not only at 4 weeks, but also up to 12 months later. Even further interesting is that our acute effects measures, the mystical experience and the insight experience, they were related to depression outcomes as well at 4 weeks, but they were no longer significant predictors of depression outcomes at 12 months. So the relationship actually outperformed these acute effects measures as a predictor of outcome up to a year later. And we see that too from the scores of Therapeutic Alliance that developed over the course of the intervention. So where does this leave us? Well, relationships are important in life. Not only are they important to us as individuals, they support our own mental health and well-being, but they're critical in therapeutic settings. They're important for not only the types of experiences that people might have with psychedelics, but also with the outcome. Therapeutic Alliance, at least in these two studies now, has shown to be an important and meaningful predictor of outcome, which I think makes a strong case for not diminishing the role of the therapy and that interaction, that it's not only important, but it might be critical to setting the foundation for understanding why this treatment might be helpful. It seems to be helpful regardless of modality. So we see this outside of psychedelic research as well. It might also mean that for some participants, for some populations, if this is such a critical factor, we might need to extend time to develop a strong relationship. It might be the case, we weren't able to dig into this with our study, but it might be the case that people who aren't responding as well, maybe they needed more time to develop that rapport, to develop that trust and that sense of connection before they receive psilocybin. But it also highlights the importance for us that this actually outperformed the acute effects measures, which was surprising, but also kind of not surprising, right? that we heal through our relationship, we heal through connection. So the fact that seems to be so important tells us that the treatment, the intervention, needs to start accounting for this more. We need to understand what therapists can do to facilitate this type of relationship formation and to strengthen those bonds. It also, which I loved Roberta's talk earlier, they mentioned also the importance of understanding how those dynamics can play out and the challenges that can come up because of creating such a bond and a connection. And to not only be aware of that, but to know how to address it in the moment might also be really critical. I wanted to just highlight some of the people that were part of this trial and a part of this specific analysis. Roland is the leader of so much of the work at Hopkins and one of my mentors, and so I'm happy to answer questions.